сожалею, что на английском будет, но если вопрос, могу ответить на вопросы на русском. Greetings again to all of you, and a special thanks then to Oksana and Dmitry for this enormous pleasure speaking to folks in Russia, where I lived until not so long ago. It was an apartment in Moscow. Great pleasure after retirement from the University of Oxford. And you see behind me St. Anthony's College. I'm an emeritus fellow at that college in Oxford. And I'm continuing to work with my colleagues in Moscow, particularly at the Center for Russian Studies, where we have a huge database on Russian towns in the late 19th century. And they're hooked up to the railroad. As Dmitry said, please understand, I would love to talk to you folks individually by email. And I work closely with Dmitry to look at papers prepared for publication, catch some little errors and some moments where you can improve them on an individual basis. Thanks very much. Here we go. So we're trying to publish here in high impact journals. Basically, that's the objective of most faculty worldwide. Okay, so from the previous lecture, I covered how the research question is, in fact, a conversation between you and those at a particular journal where you have decided to submit your paper. And you have done so, according to the reasons we'll talk about in a minute, because the journal's impact factor and the journal's concern with your conversation. And what that will mean, we'll talk about that in a few seconds. The journal, you will, the data, the method will also be concerning, and the draft submission. From this one lecture, what I'm hoping to cover is how to view that publication place that you decide on as a publication niche, a niche question, a niche research project. And to construct the paper, writing the abstract, structuring this paper, writing the literature review, and covering data and method with the perspective of that niche. So here we go. I've always perceived the critical issue for everyone, myself included, getting that research question right. And it sometimes takes an enormous amount of work. I talked to Jeremy Apek, a distinguished economic historian in my field. He said, generally, an article takes me 2 years, he said. But on the other hand, he publishes about 5 articles a year. So that's what we aim for. High impact people aim for about 3 to 5 a year. That's a lot for people. So the first thing you do is think carefully, if you're writing from Russia, about the discipline that you're contributing to. And can I emphasize those words, contributing to? You're contributing to a conversation, you're contributing to a field, you're contributing to a lifetime of scholarship. And the most important thing in consideration of your piece by the editor is, how does it contribute? How much does it contribute? Is it new? So, and here we go from last time, a description of social science research. I hope that concerns most of you. I deal with the social sciences, and really the way to write a research paper in history or the humanities is quite different. And so this is this is for you, for Ranyapa people, and Ranyapa people are generally social science, so I'm comfortable about that. Of course, the first thing you do when you're thinking of your research question, you kind of know what it is, and you've written a draft of something you think is important, is you search the journal databases for articles which cover that precise field. And if you don't find any, on the one hand, you can breathe a sigh of relief that no one has published before you. I actually just, something I was writing, I actually just found an article, a book right on my topic. So that forced me to revise, and not give up, but revise my question a little bit. Okay, so you search your journal databases. using your keywords for that niche article. Supposing you're writing an article on sports in the 1990s and how sports in many ways it is a classic Soviet achievement, the attachment to sports, the sense in which it represented the achievements of the economy and society. And so you want to find out what happened in the 1990s when the regime shifts to a market-based orientation. Does that change or does it last? So let's just take a view and see if that's something we can get a handle on. Keywords, authors' names. You don't know that yet, although you might have a few ideas. The second thing you want to search for when you're searching journal repository like JSTOR is recent. Don't go back too far. And I'll explain more about that in a few minutes. Don't go back too far. Authors' names, journal, and the related disciplines. And then you also search by the data that you've used to see if it's in common use or it's more rare. And you stick that in the back of your mind. As I say, especially for author, then you've suddenly found the magical work on sports in Russia in the 1990s, and you read it entirely. You say, well, this was published in 1998, so it's a little early. So that's still okay. It might give me a lot of ideas. And then you read the references. You go to the references and you say 5 of them, and you read those entirely. And then you add all of the references to a separate directory in your paper, in your paper file on your computer. You just add the references and maybe an abstract in file form. So when we get to this point, I think hard to see that down there. When we get to this point, sometimes you'll jump on the web and they'll say, well, I'll use EndNote. But I don't advise that because it just puts an additional step and it costs money. And it puts an additional step in the process. You don't need that step these days. 10 years ago, yes, it was useful. Now you just download the file and put it in your directory. So you can also search by your method. Some of you are economists, some sociologists, some political economists. And so, of course, we have two kinds of articles then. One, those which use a very sophisticated, contemporary, statistical method. And you will then find Social Science Quarterly or one of the journals which actually caters to those methods. And that's where you're going to place it. Those tend to be very high impact journals. So you better make sure that your method is on top of all the recent literature. But most of us actually write a lot very different things. Yes, we all sort of co-author with econometricians, as I do, to make sure that that's an important part of our work. But at the same time, sometimes we use just survey data and analyze it in a very straightforward manner. And sometimes we have a case study. So where do we place those? The curious thing is that many people sort of back off from the word case study, but I'd like to put it forward more in this discussion. Why? Because case studies are great for these big journals. Management and business journals just love case studies from Russia, I find. And they're eager to actually come to Russia to give lectures because they know you've got, especially at Ranyap, you've got a great business school. And they'd like to help foster that new knowledge. It's a new market economy. How are these business guys doing? So you can say this is a case study of such and such a trend in management literature. You find your author who has contributed in this particular sphere of, say, business management, personnel, whatever it is, okay? Furthermore, you can press forward with your case study for Russia as a narrative, as an ethnography. You can publish an ethnography journal. You say, well, look at this particular instance of what you're studying, grounded theory, of course, and you can use your survey data, as I say, in that case study. However, if you're going to try to sell your survey data, you probably want to try, among other things, regional studies journals. journals that are interested particularly in Russia. Economics and geography, sociology, international affairs, they're out there and they're waiting for your submission. They love submissions from Russian authors. So this is a great time for you to submit, okay? History, interdisciplinary journals, unfortunately, are very few, but there is the Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies, Economic Development and Cultural Change, which also would be receptive, as I say, to this outlier. Is Russia in Europe? Isn't it? Has it been in the past and now? Is it in Europe? And those sorts of questions are very consuming, and they're modern and they're timeless. But here's the problem. These regional studies journals may have a slightly lower impact assessment. If you get to your management journals, they're right up there at the top at 3 or 4. So you might want to take that hit, which is okay. So you have this Russian study. Where do you put it? One of the first places, of course, you will already know that you go to are journals in the field. And those published outside of Russia are listed in this Slavic review. Let's see if I can get there. There you go. Related journals in Russian. Look at all those journals. Canadian, Slavonic, current, died, no. Communist and post-communist studies is a great place for economists and geographers. Dostoevsky East-West Education, Eurasian Geography and Economics is a relatively high impact journal. Europe-Asia Studies also relatively high. Jahrbuch für Geschichte Europas is a great place for history. And Kino, Kultura, so forth. All of these are right here. All right, we go back. Russian Review. Now, I'm just going to give you a sense, closer sense than I tried to in the last more general lecture of what these impact factors are. Now, I guess if you're an economist, you want an impact factor to go over 1 or 2. So, but sometimes that's just not going to be possible if you have a strictly regional studies journal. And I've received many letters back from publishers saying, you really ought to try this in a regional studies journal, which caters to your area. In other words, you publishing things that the general reader just doesn't know anything about. Okay, so Russian Review, look at that, 0.55. Slavic Review, a little bit more popular. Oops. Canadian Slavic Review, look at Europe-Asia Studies. Europe-Asia Studies is more, has more statistics in its articles. Eurasian Geography and Economics is way up there at 2.088. And that basically, they really do almost require statistics, econometrics, and geography and economics orientation. But they're a great journal, fast turnaround. Journal of Comparative Economics is certainly one of the major journals in the field. Economics of Transition looks very kindly on Russian stuff. The Russian Journal of Economics at 0.95 is really high impact, and it's Russian. And so we move to European Journal, we move to the next one. The topic that I wanted to somehow put before you is that it's really important in looking for the impact factor to understand that that's a huge part of the question. In other words, whether it's published outside of Russia or within Russia is of almost no importance to your university. So the Russian journals are a good place to publish, and they are now, many of them at world standards. High impact factor, Russian Journal of Economics, and it will be very good for the university and for the country if you publish in these. I still remember looking at the shares of scientific WOS publications in the world by China, which started dramatically to uptick in the 1990s when all of these Chinese journals came on board. Of course, if you want to publish, there are many journals that run yet, but there's also a book series. Here's a little sort of something to the institution where I work. I am at the Center for Russian Studies. And so I love Dela. And then we go into this, which is, as I say, where is I've lost my cursor. That sometimes happens to me. Nope. Well, let's see if I can get my other. Sorry, guys, I've lost my cursor. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to start share again. So here's scientific journals. Экономическая политика, Экондуз, Public Administration, Государство, религия, эстетика в России, Sociology of Power, Шаги, let's see, Economics of Science, Russian Journal of Economics, Russian Peasant Studies. Wow. So if I were in your position, I would also think strongly of publishing there because you get a sort of a priority. And that's always nice in a journal. That's nice to present to the editors so they can publish their own, which they like to do. Let me just mention also in Moscow, the publications of Higher School of Economics, some of which I've published, like Foresight and STI Governance. There's also Higher Education. They're very sophisticated journals, mathematics in a statistical sense, mathematics, legal issues in digital age, business, society, and government, urban studies, public administration. I believe I published there too. Demographic Review, edited by Wisniewski, edited very, very distinguished people. Law Journal of the Higher School of Economics, Organizational Psychology, Russian Sociological Review. So you got the picture. And just one more final plug on that is that Russia indeed has started to go immediately in the last year, have started to increase their Web of Science share of citations. And that's the article that I cite for that generalization. So return to the issue of, is your work a case study? When we say, what is a case study? A case study is not just, I'm going to talk about Russia in relationship to this. And of course, that's the way you market it. But in a high impact journal, your case study needs to be properly laid out as a case study. So case studies get editors of management business journals excited. As I say, geography data. I don't know what happened to my case study slide. I lost a slide in there, but the case study needs to be billed as a proper case study, as I say, with a close description of whether it's a typical case study or an outlier, how it compares, and so forth. But I focus on this, and I will focus on it more in regard to the other parts of your paper, that it's really, really important to know exactly where your case study falls in its relationship to other literature and the general level of knowledge. Probably I'm talking too fast, so I'll try to slow down just a little bit, maybe take a breather. You've been listening for a while. Okay. So now we're on to the next stage. And this is the tricky part. So you've got your journal, and the journal which is interested in your niche area of research. And the journal is called Sports in the Modern Era, say, Hypothesized. And you've got your 1990s. So you read through about the latest 5 years of the journal, and you realize, alas, no one's talking about the 1990s anymore, but you're persistent. And so you say, well, how can I fit this in? So you realize that in some sports journals, they're talking about transition experiences. They say transitioning from one kind of regime to another, and how does sports fit in? Does it bridge that transition? Does a certain sports attitude always persist in populations? So if that's the way the journal wants to look at it, and what do I mean? How does the journal look at it? What I mean is a journal tends to publish certain major authors. And I'm sure you know that. It's bad news for some and good news for others. And so you have editors waiting to get new pieces which reflect already published pieces in their journals. And that's what I mean conversation. That's what I mean niche. It's a niche place for just exactly what you want to do. So what you do is with that 1990s, sports in the 1990s, is you don't abandon your topic because you've got all this research and you've got a paper written on the topic and so forth. So you just tweak that research question and you say, okay, you realize looking at all this literature in the journal, and you say that somewhere in the introduction, that there are a lot of works on sports in transition countries and the continuity of sports over regime change. And so you say, indeed, if we focus on football, we find out this is a really important topic because we understand that there are social implications for football in Britain. Football is heavily associated with social class, and it's really important to national character. So you say that perspective, or you say, you can say that it fits in to that, and that would be number 2, revise a classical understanding. Or number 1 is the most common justification, and this is going to come in your abstract, it's going to come again in your introduction, is very little writing on this topic. And it's quite important. So your first sentence is, this topic is quite important. And the second is, what a surprise in the literature that there's very little on it. Okay, you guys know that. Okay. So then in Regional Studies Journal, you can also say, well, we note that there's a current concern in this journal for blah, 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 special issue. But interestingly enough, there are no historical articles to represent that precedent. Fill a gap in the literature. Number 3, new disciplinary approach for a social methods journal. You have the 90s, but you also have a brand new method. After all, as we all know, surveys are now being examined by econometricians and quantitative historians. Surveys are now much easier to understand. You have propensity score matching. And if you hit the statistical social science journals, you'll find that a lot of them are using propensity score matching. It seems to be satisfactory. And so you say, I'm going to apply propensity score matching on surveys taken in the 1990s about sports. And you can submit that then to a statistics journal, Social Science Quarterly, or one of the social science journals. So I hope that's clear. I would say the most popular reason for writing an article, and the reason editors are most willing to publish it, is that it fills an important gap in the literature. But also, there are more classic past and present, more classic, more famous journals, really high impact journals, who like to say, well, this classical understanding has never been challenged before. So you have a new case study which shows that your case is special. Or you have a new model that's been used in econometrics to revise Vogel's great interpretation that the railroad doesn't matter too much in American U.S. history. You say, but it does matter. And in fact, there are a lot of journal articles these days, mattered in Sweden, mattered in Britain, mattered in France, mattered in Spain, that are taking a new approach based on new theories of growth. And so you're revising a classical understanding from your field based on new economic or sociological theories. And I think discourse analysis might be included in that. You say, well, it's never been looked at before from the perspective this perspective of discourse. Or, as I say, the third. And probably some of you can come up with more excuses, but using a hot current statistical econometric approach, as I say, a new disciplinary approach, is always a good way to sell an article. So you found the journal, go back to your research question and reformulate it to make it plug into that niche. And you read the authors. So now you go after that author that looks very similar to you, and you read a lot of stuff that he or she has written. and find other places where that person has published to be your fallback journals. And you rework the questions, I say, to fit them. Among the common problems that you're going to find, as I say, let's take this example of Russian sports in the 1990s, is that the time frame is just no longer of interest. If you look over the past 5 years of the major journals where Russia, Europe, Asia study and so forth, less and less will be given to Russia in the 1990s. It was extremely timely when you wanted to publish something in the early 20s, but now people have forgotten, life moves on. I hope there's never a time where people forget the major stuff like the Russian Revolution. So, but just not of interest, not hot, as I put it. But the question itself is not really of interest. Hypothesize that you're submitting to a journal for discourse. Well, we positivists, so I gladly and proudly proclaim myself to be a positivist, we have to publish in social science journals because those discourse journals just, don't want to deal with that. Or your question is just too narrow. You've narrowed it down. You've got this wonderful data on 1995. And you found a journal that loves stuff on the Russian transition, but somehow 1995 is not enough. So if you will take that 1995 data, don't give up on it. Say it's a great year, it's a typical year for transition, or it's an atypical year for transition. And if we just compare it, for example, to the Czech Republic or to Slovakia or to Bulgaria, to other transition countries, in that year, you'll see how far Russia, in fact, actually went. This incredible early achievement in transition. And so that comparative framework gives you an edge. Sometimes it happens, however, and very frequently it happens, that for a journal, now this is the thing to really watch out. It's in gray here, but I want to emphasize it. For a journal which is interested in sports, for example, your question may well be sports popularity identity too broad. I think you'll find if you Google sports popularity identity, there are massive numbers of articles on that topic. And so what you will have to do if your question is too broad and the journal is interested in some new original discoveries, you're going to make it impossible to say, this is my contribution, because your question is just too broad. So you narrow it a little bit. Find your niche. That's what I mean by niche. And then here I wanted to just mention again the case study. When you say, well, this is a case study of countries seeking to build their identity by using, among other things, sports. And you say it's a case study of what? And I still remember a great paper a couple of years ago for my methods course in public policy that we were doing this program, public policy, master's in English. And it was the topic, I think you will understand, is immensely appealing. I don't think he's gone on to write an article about it, but the repurposing of Nizhny Novgorod's Olympic Stadium. So you say, what is that a case study of? And then I remember, of course, all these Olympic stadiums in Montreal and Latin America, and nothing happens after in Britain. You've got this Hadley, this place in London, which was built up for the Olympics, and everybody promised that afterwards, yes, this will be a center, people want to live there. No. So he said, well, we repurpose the stadium, turn it into a football. You have to, cutting down on the size, changing it substantially. So a case study of what? Is it a case study of Russia during the Olympics? Is it a case study of repurposing Olympic facilities? And then you say, well, is Russia's response typical or extreme? And you're going to have to argue that case. People, when they say case study, assume that that's, it's a wonderful thing to say when you're applying, when you're submitting a paper, that this is a case study. But you got to be very careful. You have to say, well, there are maybe 100 examples that I'm talking about, and this would be a case study in Russia, which in fact did repurpose many of these Olympic facilities, especially the winter ones, a case study of a positive extreme. That is a typical case study in Montreal. Nothing happened. It's a museum, and it's still sitting there from the 1990s. And then, of course, you say, how do you know? You might want to produce a little bit of a chart saying where this case study lands in terms of comparative analysis. So then the first thing that you do after you have identified your research topic, you've narrowed it down, you're pretty satisfied that this journal would take it, where do you go? The first thing you do, believe it or not, all the guidelines will tell you it's the last thing you do. In my experience, it's much more useful to write it and rewrite it and rewrite it. I may have written each abstract that I write maybe 10 times, including before I send it in. Why is because it's a think through. It's a sort of, it forces you to say in words of one syllable, as an American expression. In words one syllable means simple, so that I can understand it. Okay, what your paper is about. And so it's an absolute template for your abstract, and you can write it before you write your paper, after, in the middle. And sometimes right in the middle of a paper, you'll go back to the abstract and you say, did I really want to write about that? The second thing is, right in the middle of your paper, you're wandering around somewhere giving examples, and you're off in your third paragraph talking about something that happened in some other country a long time ago. So you go back and read your abstract and say, whoops, that doesn't pertain, cut it. Keep the paper driving it, focusing it on that first sentence. This paper concerns. This paper explains how cross-regime divisions, sports, maybe one of the few areas of entertainment, can last as a great identifier of the peoples. But that's your first sentence. But of course, not quite enough. This paper explains, in the context of a Russian case study from transition, how sports can remain an identifier of national identity. Your next sentence is going to be, I warn you, is going to be, our data comes from sports from the 1990s. Indeed, we've taken a typical year, 1995, to show resemblance to the typical year of 1975. How many people attend, we have surveys, what they think of it, and how closely going to sports represents something that they love about their country. Okay. Next sentence, that's your second sentence, our data. And you explain it in parentheses, you say where the data comes from, so that the reader instantly knows in the social sciences that you're not just talking. Okay. Then your third sentence in this abstract, and this is something that people seem to be very shy about doing, but I always encourage them not to be shy about it, just right up there. If you read social science journals a lot and read them quickly, you'll see in every abstract almost, you'll read, contribution of this paper is, and then you say, is that this aspect of sports studies has been relatively unexamined, or that although this aspect of sports studies has been examined in many journals and is an important broad question, it's important to understand by local information about this transition exactly how love of sports didn't change, regardless of whether people had to pay to get tickets, whether they were free, whether they were encouraged by their university or workplace to go to games. It didn't change. It was a part. So economic development and cultural change would be an ideal journal for something like this. You've got the statistics, you've got how society is not changing, and you've got how these feelings last across a regime change. And then that's it. You stop. Keep yourself from going with that. That's it. No more abstract. That's it. No references, no fourth paragraph, no comparison to other countries. Just that. So that when someone is looking through a journal and they see that abstract, they say, wow, that's what I want to read. They don't want to read the fluff, just the stuff. So each journal has its own requirements, of course, for an abstract, and you need to read those carefully in the guidelines. Generally speaking, 150 to 300 words. Your research question, your data and your method, your results and their significance, and that's it. Some geography journals, mathematical journals require that you tell your hypothesis and results. Some require that you don't talk about a hypothesis. Some say you want a little more. All of them tend to ask for simple, clear sentences, no footnotes or references in your abstract, no extra words, write, edit, and rewrite when you finish your paper. So the abstract. Another just bit of advice, these days English has become in some ways really rigid, especially for that kind of writing abstract, active voice. The Russian has these beautiful, one of the reasons I became Russianist was the language, the beautiful sort of passive voice. And within that passive voice, you can say a million things with enormous subtlety and variation. But English doesn't let you do that. Contemporary journalese requires that everything's active. And for your abstract, you probably want to put it in the past tense since you have already done this research. So general subject, data and method, results, and the larger significance, as I say. Questions, I'll be glad to questions. By the way, when you send me a paper that you'd like me to just to read or look at or help with, I'm really going to look for this structure. And I really don't want to read it unless it has that abstract and in exactly the format that I said. I want the significance of it in that first sentence and why this paper makes a contribution. So now let's go to the structure of the paper. And probably, again, this will hold no surprises for those of you who already publish. So excuse me if I'm telling you things you already know. But hopefully, I hope it'll just help repeat them what is most important. Your introduction. The introduction, actually, the first paragraph of the introduction can be the abstract. And that's frequently in economic journals exactly what happens. Okay, so the next few paragraphs can be background, history, further identification of the topic. And some journals require that you actually put the literature review in that introduction because they don't want to read a long literature review. Those are the more statistical journals. They just want the core stuff and results and data method. And then right at the end of that paragraph, let's say you're doing a standard article that does have a literature review, you block it out. Intro, literature review, 3, data and method, 4, results, 5, conclusions, and that's it. It's standard. In social science journals, that's it. That's the end of the story. That's what you do. And I think you'll find in writing such a paper of any page, it really is helpful. It lets you stop doing what you're doing after a few paragraphs. Transitions are very, very important. And it will allow the reader to focus on exactly what you want him or her to want them to read. Okay. And here's the grabber. The final paragraph of your introduction, again, absolutely standard. And many journals, like the Social Science Quarterly, says in the final paragraph of your introduction, you must, and that tells you exactly what you do. Very simple. This paper is organized in so many parts. In part 2, following the introduction, we argue that blah, 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 blah is an important point in the literature, important contribution. In part 3, we talk about our model and our statistics. In part 4, we present our results. And part 5 is conclusion. Full stop. Sometimes journals will require that you actually give them a little bit more taste to what you're doing. In part 2, we use a model drawn from the theory of blah, blah, blah. And we apply this to our Russian database of blah, blah, blah. In part 4, we cover results, and these results fully confirm our theory, but they do not confirm blah, blah, blah. So let's move on to the literature review. And here we go again. You're back with the journals. You're back to the Google Scholar. You're back to JSTOR, EBSCO. And I can't tell you how important it is to go recent, and to go recent and classic. There have been numerous occasions in which I missed an article. And as recently as last year, we sent a piece to a major journal. And it turned out that the person that we missed his article in that journal, that's the guy they sent the article to review. So of course he's not going to accept the article. So you don't want to miss that. You don't want to do that thing that was just sloppy on my part. Okay, so, but one of the things that will really help you, I mean, I hope this is useful advice, is that when you're going through the search for material and you don't want a whole lot of books, unfortunately, you can't just glob in everything, because there are two reasons for that. One, every time you cite something, you have to have a reference. And many journals will limit the number of references you can have. Second, you want the classics. I have overheard scholarly conversations in which they say, but so-and-so cited that paper of mine and it really wasn't relevant. So you've got to cite the paper that is exactly what it says. Otherwise, some reader is going to catch that and say, but he's citing this thing that was written years ago, didn't have anything to do with the topic. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to cite too many books. You want very, very careful selection of what in your literature review you cite that is exactly to the point that you're making. And one of the ways you can do that is by skimming the book reviews. Because in the book reviews, the reviewer will say that. They'll say, well, so-and-so writes a great history of the Russian Revolution, but he certainly missed Bulgakov's article on emotion, and therefore he missed an entire thread in the literature. And therefore, when you're writing something on the Russian Revolution, you go to Bulgakov, you read it, you read the book, and you understand what thread that this author had been missing. And then you go back to your article and you say, in coverage of the Russian Revolution, such and such a Bulgakov may be missed. And so we're emphasizing a part of his work as the main focus of our contribution. So, right? So the lit review is organized then according you're not writing a narrative of everybody who's written on it. You're not in the slightest. Nobody wants to know that. Because people who are reading your article are pretty aware of what's been written already. Remember that this is a niche journal, a niche topic, and the guys who want to read it have read the previous articles in that journal. And so you don't do that. You can say, the origin of this question lies in the exploration carried out by Eric Hobsbawm on the Industrial Revolution. But you mustn't go further than that. You say, apropos of these data on the Russian Industrial Revolution, the following articles have been major works. And you mention that. But in particular, you mention a few of the major ones. In particular, so-and-so very closely follows this trend that we're writing about now. So I thought, so you want to note trends in the field, but only if they apply to your contribution. Literature reviews should not be extensive. They should be well targeted and careful. Okay. One thing that my econometric friends tell me, and that he always, my co-author does, which I think is great, and helps me out. I can't really quote econometric works because I don't follow the literature, but he does, and so he sort of will introduce his data and methods in the literature section. He will say, "We follow blah blah blah," in his testing of this econometric, and that's it. You know, the most recent, the most important test used. And so, do you need to discuss that? No. Because anyone reading the article will understand exactly what it is, and people not interested in the econometric won't pay any attention anyway. Okay. So, of course, you can focus in the lit review on debates, conflicts, and contradictions, and where the sources disagree. And of course, you mentioned pivotal publications that change the direction of the field away from or toward your article. Again, if this is where the justification of your article comes through. What is your article doing? What is your contribution doing? And you want that in the last paragraph of the lit review. This literature shows that there really is a gap in the literature where the article that we're submitting is going to be particularly powerful in influencing the way other scholars will write about the 1990s. You will want also to introduce works that suggest a weakness in the literature without criticizing any particular author. Really important not to criticize people in a lit review. I can't tell you how awful it would be to have them send the article to that particular person. Okay. Then basically, this is from last lecture, you write about what's understood, what's not well understood, and how your contribution adds value. And that's it. So then the next bit is data and methods. And I've done this before, but I'll do it again. Data and method is really important, as you know, in statistical works, but it's also important in survey works. So if you're doing an experimental survey, for example, you really want to say that this paper reflects a survey taken in the 1990s. At that time, it was not possible to do a telephone survey, or at that time, it was not possible to get a representative sampling from all of Russia. Or at that time, it was not possible to get a representative sampling even from all of Moscow, because there was a lot of mobility and flowing out, who lived in Moscow, questions about the demographics and so forth. So you explain that weakness, but then you say, but like Mr. blah, 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 who in his study of the Czech Republic for the same period, we selected particular neighborhoods representing particular classes of people. And we surveyed those neighborhoods so that we have a representative sampling of neighborhoods. And then once you've clarified that, and you don't go on to generalize, and you then go back to your abstract and add that this is not a representative sampling of all of Moscow, but a representative sampling of neighborhoods of Moscow. And exactly the same you do want to do for your case study. You say, again, you repeat this case study. And if you feel you don't have a case study that's really representative, that's fine. The important thing that you understand that you choose a journal that likes that kind of narratives, phenomenology. It likes personal narratives. It likes biographies. And there are many journals out there, anthropology and field work. What you do in sort of the anthropology business, as you well know, and anthropologists always know much more than I do about what they do, is that you describe the field. You describe whether it's been done before. You describe the country. And if it's sociology or economics or history, of course, you always want to bring in that comparative feature, because sometimes you will find an article on Brazil that reflects exactly what you want to say about some other country. So you discuss your data, how representative they are. You, again, go after the significance. And one of the things you might find in your article on sports is that by the end of your article, your view may have changed. And it may have changed significantly, but that's okay. You change it in the abstract, you change it in the lit review, and you change it in because somehow you realize that regime change is important in some way. In other words, regime change, say in the 1990s, created an enormous amount of poverty in some areas of the country. And so those people couldn't participate in sports anymore. Maybe they had trouble, of finding a sports arena or paying for it or whatever. So you say, well, Upon reflection, we find that this is not a case study of any regime transition, but a particular regime transition. And you say, but that's okay because there are other outliers. China's an outlier, and there are lots of outliers in the world. Okay. Then you go data and method, you go to your model, and we'll talk about your assumptions. You're very careful about your assumptions and your testable hypotheses. And then when I've heard my colleagues in political science here at St. Anthony's College again and again say, what did they find in their PhD thesis, MA thesis, and people that no one is properly addressing the issue of the dependent variable. And it can't tell you how important that is. Okay, your dependent variable should get a special paragraph. And why you selected this dependent variable. And it could be that you didn't have others. Could be that the data was missing the right dependent variable. So here's what you do. You say, the data doesn't really have the dependent variable that I want, like that longitudinal number of people attending football in Nizhny Novgorod. But it does have representative years. I once heard a presentation about agriculture, industrialization of agriculture that had 7 data points. The 16th was 2 in the 17th century and the rest of the 18th century. Data wasn't there, but here are my generalizations. And believe it or not, this article was published. Okay, so you don't have the right dependent variable. You don't have a longitudinal stretch of data. You don't have every year filled out. But here's the way you argue it. You say, but in so-and-so's work on sports in Germany, in the transition years, uses the following indicators, which I have used in my work. And so you blame it on him or her. And you cite that work, parenthesis author date, and move on. Don't let it get you down. And that's fine. I mean, if someone else has done it, published it with your kind of, with a lack of data, that's fine. You just argue your way out of it. So yeah, I guess a paper is really a contribution which you're arguing. And you have standards, of course, but it's an original contribution in which you're arguing that your approach is okay because you're leaning on articles that went ahead of that. And then, of course, in your data and method section, you must explain what your model cannot do, will not do, and where its weaknesses are. In other words, your model did not account for everything. And in your most advanced statistical meaning tests, your T is not there. These not robust. And so you had to do yet another test. That particular place in your article will, of course, be the most read section. What your model does not do. Where are the problems with it, and how did you resolve them in order to establish the originality of this particular contribution? In your conclusion, you will then say, but that's left for future research. Now, Dmitry has told me that I can stop here, but I've been delighted to answer questions if there are any.
Да, Кэрол, спасибо большое. Коллеги, задавайте, пожалуйста, вопросы. Если у кого-то так же плохо с разговорным английским, как у меня, то можете задать по-русски. Кэрол